They were among the most capable military commanders of the 20th century, men who conquered nations, held back overwhelming enemy offensives, and became household names on both sides of the front line. Some were admired even by their enemies. Others were feared for their brutality. But almost none of them got to choose how their story ended. Forced suicide, execution by piano wire, death in Soviet captivity. A handful managed to grow old in quiet obscurity. This is the story of what actually happened to the generals of Hitler's Wehrmacht, the men who fought his war, and, in the end, answered for it in wildly different ways. 3 separate forces would ultimately decide most of their fates. The first was the 20th of July 1944 plot, a failed assassination attempt against Hitler carried out by a group of officers who had grown convinced the war was unwinnable and the regime irredeemable. In the aftermath, roughly 7,000 people were arrested, and around 200 were executed, sweeping up not just direct conspirators, but officers whose only crime was a private conversation, a rumour, or simple proximity to the wrong person. The second force was the collapsing military situation itself in 1944 and 1945, which put commanders in impossible positions ordered by Hitler to hold ground that couldn't be held, with the alternative being dismissal, arrest, or worse. And the third was the reckoning that came after the war, the Nuremberg trials, the subsequent High Command trial, and a wave of national and Allied prosecutions that forced surviving commanders to answer, in courtrooms, for decisions made on some of the most destructive battlefields in human history. Keep those 3 threads in mind as we go, because you'll see them intersect again and again in the stories that follow. Few German commanders of the Second World War earned the kind of reputation Erwin Rommel did. Fighting with chronically limited resources in North Africa, he won a string of stunning victories that made him famous, respected not just by his own troops, but by the British soldiers who fought against him. He was one of Hitler's most trusted field commanders, and yet, remarkably, he was respected across enemy lines as well. In July 1944, near Normandy, Rommel's staff car was strafed by Allied fighters, and he narrowly escaped with his life. While he was recovering in the hospital, the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler unfolded. By this point, Rommel had grown disillusioned with Hitler. Introduced by his chief of staff, Hans Speidel, he had met with resistance figures like Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, and by most accounts he agreed that if Hitler were removed, the war in the West needed to end. But he opposed assassinating Hitler outright. He believed the dictator needed to be put on trial to prevent Germany from descending into civil war. Photographs later discovered would show Rommel had deeper connections to the conspirators than previously believed, though the precise extent of his involvement remains disputed by historians to this day. After the July plot failed, testimony from Speidel and others led the Nazi military honour court to name Rommel a co-conspirator, despite thin evidence. Hitler understood that publicly executing Germany's most celebrated general as a traitor would devastate military morale, so instead he offered Rommel a choice: take his own life, and his family and staff would be protected. On the 14th of October 1944, Generals Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Maisel arrived at Rommel's home to deliver the ultimatum. He said goodbye to his wife and teenage son, telling them plainly that he had roughly 3 minutes to decide, and that refusing meant not only his own execution but the arrest of his entire family and staff. He got into a car with the 2 generals, and during the drive he swallowed a cyanide capsule and died within minutes. The Nazi regime announced that he had succumbed to injuries from his wounds at Normandy, declared a state funeral, and gave him full military honours, with Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt delivering the eulogy, almost certainly without knowing the true circumstances of Rommel's death. The Gestapo then cremated his body, destroying any evidence that might have contradicted the official story. It would take years after the war for the full truth of what had happened in that car to become widely known. Fedor von Bock, another capable and deeply ambitious commander, came closer than almost anyone to defeating the Soviet Union in 1941, only to see his success unravel under Hitler's own decisions. That autumn, leading roughly 1.5 million men, Bock prepared Operation Typhoon, Germany's final push toward Moscow. By early December, German tank units had advanced to within just 19 kilometres of the Soviet capital, and Bock believed victory was within reach. Then, within days, exhausted and freezing German forces were hit by Zhukov's counteroffensive. Army Group Centre was forced into a retreat that cost it over 100,000 men and hundreds of tanks. The failure of the operation cost Bock his command. Ongoing conflict with Hitler followed, and by July 1942 he was dismissed entirely, retreating into a quiet, secluded life. On the 4th of May 1945, while fleeing from Schleswig toward Hamburg, his car came under strafing fire from Allied fighters. His wife, stepdaughter, and the friend driving the car were all killed instantly. Bock himself was mortally wounded. He died in a hospital the following day. According to some accounts, his final words to Erich von Manstein were, "Save Germany." Known as Hitler's fireman for his ability to stabilise collapsing fronts, Walter Model built his reputation on defensive warfare against the Red Army. But by March 1945, the situation he faced had become genuinely hopeless. Allied forces had broken through near the Rhine, fuel supplies were nearly gone, and he had only about 70 tanks left under his command. Hitler ordered him to hold his position and wait for reinforcements under General Walther Wenck, reinforcements that, in reality, didn't exist. On April 1st, roughly 300,000 troops of Army Group B were encircled in the Ruhr pocket. By April 5th, Model had authorised his division commanders to surrender if necessary, and by mid-April the pocket had been completely split apart by Allied forces. His final operational order instructing General Fritz Bayerlein to break through the encirclement with just 12 remaining tanks was simply impossible to execute. When General Matthew Ridgway suggested surrender, Model refused, declaring that a German field marshal did not surrender. He soon dissolved Army Group B altogether. On April 20th, Joseph Goebbels publicly denounced him as a traitor. Model spent his final night in the field with his officers, entrusting a letter for his wife to an aide. When word reached him that the Soviets had charged him as a war criminal, he saw only one path left. On the 21st of April 1945, Model walked into a forest near Duisburg and shot himself. He was buried where he fell. His son Hans later recovered his remains and reburied him. Ferdinand Schörner, one of Hitler's most trusted generals and the Wehrmacht's final supreme commander, was known less for strategic brilliance than for sheer brutality. Nicknamed Bloody Ferdinand, he enforced discipline through terror, hanging deserters from trees and personally ordering executions. As the war neared its end, Schörner's Army Group Centre attempted a desperate breakout toward American lines in the west, hoping to avoid falling into Soviet hands. Even after Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz ordered surrender to the Western Allies, Schörner abandoned his own command on the night of the 8th of May 1945, fled in civilian clothes, and flew by private plane to Austria. He surfaced at the headquarters of the German First Army on May 15th, but they didn't welcome his arrival and handed him over to American forces, who in turn transferred him to the Soviets in June 1945. Schörner spent 10 years in the Gulag before being handed to East Germany, finally released in 1955. Back in West Germany, he faced another trial this time for ordering the execution of his own soldiers, and received a 4.5-year sentence, released in 1960. He spent his remaining years quietly in Munich, refusing to speak publicly about the war, and died of a heart attack in 1973 at the age of 81. Eduard Dietl earned his reputation in 1940, leading the 3rd Mountain Division at Narvik, Norway. 10 German destroyers had landed his troops there, only to be sunk during the ensuing naval battle. Despite being outnumbered by British, French and Polish forces, Dietl fought a stubborn defensive campaign through the mountainous terrain. When Germany's victory on the Western Front forced Allied troops to withdraw, Dietl reoccupied the city and earned the nickname the Hero of Narvik. In 1944, he clashed with Hitler over troop deployments, proposing that forces be moved from Norway to reinforce the Eastern Front, a plan Hitler firmly rejected. On June 23rd that year, Dietl and 3 senior officers boarded a Junkers 52 transport plane en route to a conference in Salzburg. The aircraft crashed near the Austrian village of Riedeneck in poor weather, killing everyone aboard. His death cost Germany's northern front its most experienced commander in mountain and Arctic warfare. Before becoming commander of the SS Totenkopf Division in 1939, Theodor Reiche had been a central figure in building the framework of the broader concentration camp system, including Dachau. The division he led went on to fight in the 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, the 1942 Summer Offensive, and the Battle of Kharkov, becoming one of the most active German formations on the Eastern Front. On the 26th of February 1943, as the Third Battle of Kharkov began, the small reconnaissance plane carrying Eicke was shot down by Soviet anti-aircraft fire south of the city, killing him instantly. The next day, additional soldiers were killed in a firefight while recovering his body under heavy fire. He was buried in Ukraine, but after the war, Soviet forces bulldozed his grave. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, former Commander-in-Chief of German forces in the West, was one of the key military figures behind the July 20th plot to kill Hitler. He was slated to take command of the Wehrmacht once Hitler was removed. But when Klaus von Stauffenberg's bomb failed to kill Hitler, the coup collapsed almost immediately. By evening, conspirators were being arrested one after another. Witzleben was arrested the next day at his country estate, stripped of rank and expelled from the military. His trial, presided over by Roland Freisler, was staged as a deliberate public humiliation. Witzleben was forced to appear in court wearing baggy trousers with no belt, enduring shouted insults calling him a traitor. Even when he attempted a Nazi salute, Freisler mocked him for it. He was sentenced to death on the spot. On der 8. August 1944, he was executed at Plötzensee prison. Following Hitler's explicit order that the conspirators die as slowly and painfully as possible, he was hanged by thin cord, often mistakenly described as piano wire suspended from a meat hook. The entire horrifying execution was filmed. Widely regarded as one of Germany's finest strategic minds, Erich von Manstein built his reputation through major operations on the Eastern Front. But his frequent clashes with Hitler over command authority ultimately led to his dismissal in 1944. Near the war's end, he was captured by British forces at a hospital. In 1949, he stood trial for war crimes in Hamburg, was found guilty and sentenced to 18 years in prison, though he was released after serving only 4, in 1953. He later served as an advisor to the West German government during its military rebuilding, and wrote several best-selling books, most notably his memoir Lost Victories, which shaped how an entire generation of readers understood the Eastern Front. Often, critics would later argue in ways that downplayed the Wehrmacht's complicity in atrocities committed alongside the SS. Manstein died of a stroke on the 9th of June 1973, at his home near Munich, at the age of 85. His funeral was conducted with full military honours, attended by hundreds of soldiers who came to see him offer striking send-off for a man who, just over 2 decades earlier, had been a convicted war criminal. Johannes Blaskowitz commanded the 8th Army during the invasion of Poland, and later served as Commander-in-Chief there. He went on to lead Army Group G against the Allied landings in southern France, and during Operation Nordwind, ultimately commanding the remnants of Army Group H as it retreated into the Netherlands and surrendered. Blaskowitz stood out among senior German officers for one striking reason. He repeatedly protested the atrocities committed by the SS. After the war, he was charged as a war criminal and brought before the High Command trial. But on the 5th of February 1948, before the verdict was reached, Blaskowitz evaded his guards and threw himself from a courthouse balcony, dying from the fall. Given how likely he was to have been acquitted of the charges against him, historians still debate to this day why he was ever prosecuted at all, and why he chose to end his life, rather than see the trial through. Gotthard Heinrici was widely regarded as one of the Wehrmacht's finest defensive commanders, famous for the strategic withdrawals and elastic defence tactics that inflicted devastating losses on the Red Army, most notably during the 1945 Battle of the Seelow Heights. That April, he commanded the last line of defence protecting Berlin, deliberately flooding parts of the Oder Valley to slow the Soviet advance. Despite fierce resistance, the Red Army eventually broke through. Heinrich refused to sacrifice his remaining troops in what he saw as a hopeless final defence of Berlin, a decision that led Wilhelm Keitel to dismiss him. Warned that returning to Berlin would mean execution, he instead led his forces west and surrendered to British troops. He was held at a British POW camp in South Wales until his release in 1948. Heinrich spent the rest of his life in Germany and died of natural causes in 1971 at the age of 85, given a funeral with full military honours. Georg Stumme took temporary command of the Afrika Korps during the Second Battle of El Alamein, stepping in for an exhausted, ailing Rommel. On the 24th of October 1942, while heading to the front with Colonel Andreas von Bulowius, his car came under concentrated enemy fire. Bulowius was killed instantly. Stumme leapt from the vehicle. When his body was later found, there were no visible wounds on it. Given his history of high blood pressure, the most likely explanation is that the extreme stress triggered a fatal heart attack just days before Rommel's own return to the front. Albert Kesselring built his reputation on the strength of his defensive campaign in Italy, fortifying natural obstacles into layered defensive lines, most famously the Gustav Line, that extended the Italian campaign by nearly 2 years and inflicted serious losses on Allied forces. He was captured near Salzburg by American troops. In 1947, a war crimes tribunal sentenced him to death, but strong public pressure in Britain, including from Winston Churchill himself, led to his sentence being commuted to life in prison. After being diagnosed with throat cancer, he was released in October 1952, a decision that sparked considerable outrage in Italy. After his release, Kesselring served as honorary chairman of several veterans' organisations and led a right-leaning veterans group called the Stahlhelm, drawing controversy along the way. In his memoirs, he portrayed himself, to the end, as a loyal soldier and a capable commander. Kesselring died of a heart attack on the 16th of July 1960 at a hospital in Bavaria at the age of 74. His funeral was conducted in full military style, with Stahlhelm members serving as pallbearers and a rifle salute fired in his honour. Former senior Nazi figures including Sepp Dietrich and Karl Dönitz attended. Sepp Dietrich was the highest-ranking field commander in the Waffen-SS. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt reportedly described him as decent but not very bright, criticising his leadership of the 6th Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge. It was during that battle that Dietrich bore responsibility for the Malmedy massacre, in which American prisoners of war were executed by his troops. Captured by American forces in March 1945, he was tried as a war criminal and sentenced to 25 years, of which he served 10. In 1956, he was arrested and tried again, this time for his role in the 1934 Night of the Long Knives, but was released in 1959 due to heart problems. Dietrich died of a heart attack in 1966 Zoll Ludwigsburg, at the age of 73. His funeral drew a crowd of roughly 6,000 people, including many former SS members. Hermann Hoth is regarded by many as one of the finest panzer commanders of the entire war. He played a critical role in the Battle of France, led the 4th Panzer Army at Stalingrad, and fought prominently at Kursk. But, after repeated defeats and mounting exhaustion in 1943, he was dismissed, with Hitler openly accusing him of spreading defeatism. Despite that, Hoth was recalled to duty in April 1945 to defend Halle and Leipzig before ultimately surrendering to American forces. At the High Command trial, he argued that his wartime conduct had been justified under the circumstances, but was sentenced to 15 years and imprisoned at Landsberg. Released on parole in April 1954, he spent his remaining years in Goslar, writing about the Second World War and defending the honour of the Wehrmacht, arguing that veterans themselves should be the ones shaping how the war's history was told, to preserve what he saw as the army's heroic image. Hoth died of natural causes on the 25th of January 1971 at the age of 85. Friedrich Paulus, commander of the 6th Army at Stalingrad, is best remembered as the first German field marshal ever to surrender to an enemy force. Trapped in the city with roughly 265,000 men, he finally raised the white flag on the 31st of January 1943. On the very day of his surrender, Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal, fully expecting, by unspoken tradition, that Paulus would take his own life rather than surrender. He didn't. Transferred to a special camp near Moscow, Paulus was closely monitored and interrogated by Soviet authorities, who used him as a propaganda tool. He initially refused to cooperate, but after the failed July 1944 plot against Hitler, he turned openly against the Nazi regime, joining the Soviet-backed National Committee for a Free Germany and later testifying as a prosecution witness at the Nuremberg trials. A remarkable turn for a man Hitler had promoted specifically to make surrender unthinkable. In 1953, Paulus returned to East Germany, where he gave public speeches condemning the leadership that had led the country into 2 catastrophic wars, effectively spending his final years as a living rebuke to the regime he had once served. Diagnosed with ALS, his health declined rapidly, and he died in Dresden on the 1st of February 1957, at the age of 66. Günther von Kluge, once one of Hitler's most trusted field marshals, took command of Army Group Center in late 1941, just as the offensive to capture Moscow collapsed. That defeat left him deeply disillusioned, and his vision of the war began to crumble. As his doubts grew, he was drawn into the resistance movement by his chief of staff, Henning von Tresckow. Kluge was famously indecisive, and had once been swayed by a 500,000 Reichsmark bribe from Hitler, but he understood the plot against Hitler's life clearly, agreeing to support a coup only once Hitler's death was confirmed. When word of the July 20th plot reached him, he agreed to participate, but the moment he heard Hitler had survived, he immediately withdrew his support and swore renewed loyalty. In mid-August 1944, an Allied air raid damaged his vehicle, cutting him off from headquarters communication for several hours. Hitler, already suspicious of him, concluded he had been secretly negotiating surrender and dismissed him from command on August 17th. Summoned to Berlin, Kluge sensed he would be arrested for treason. On the 19th of August 1944, on the road from Paris toward Metz, he took a cyanide capsule and killed himself, leaving behind a letter urging Hitler to end the war. Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's finest armoured warfare commanders, clashed repeatedly with Hitler throughout the war. His aggressive strategy during the drive on Moscow, and his refusal to obey Hitler's order to hold position at all costs, led to his dismissal in December 1941. But after the July 1944 assassination attempt, he returned to power as acting chief of the General Staff and became deeply involved in purging officers suspected of disloyalty to the regime. Guderian surrendered to American forces on the 10th of May 1945 and was held until 1948. Released without ever being formally charged, he devoted his remaining years to writing. He died of heart disease on the 14th of May 1954, at the age of 65, living out his final years with lingering bitterness that Hitler had so often refused to listen to him. Hasso von Manteuff earned a fearsome reputation as an armoured commander, inflicting heavy losses on American forces at the Battle of Bastogne in 1944. By March 1945, he was rushed to the collapsing Eastern Front, but Soviet breakthroughs forced a retreat, and that same year he surrendered to British forces. Held first at Island Farm, and then in American custody, he was released in 1946. He went on to serve as a spokesman for the Free Democratic Party, strongly advocating for West Germany's rearmament. But in 1959, his past resurfaced when he was convicted of manslaughter for wartime conduct, and sentenced to 18 months, though public pressure secured his early release. In his later years, he served as an advisor to NATO. Manteuffel died quietly while on vacation in Austria on the 24th of September 1978 at the age of 81. Finally, Gerd von Rundstedt, widely regarded as one of the most stable and respected commanders in the Wehrmacht, sensed, around the time of the Normandy landings, that the war was already lost, and urged Hitler to pursue a peace settlement. He was immediately dismissed for it, only to be recalled just months later to help plan the Battle of the Bulge, a last desperate offensive he reportedly knew was doomed to fail from the start. Rundstedt was dismissed again in March 1945, and captured by American forces that May. His health deteriorated so badly during initial interrogation that he suffered a heart attack, and he was released in 1948. He spent his final years in a nursing home and died of heart failure in Hanover on the 24th of February 1953 at the age of 77. 18 careers. 18 wildly different endings: suicide under duress, execution by hanging, death in combat, years in Soviet captivity, and, for a handful, quiet old age in post-war Germany. Some faced justice for genuine atrocities. Others died before any reckoning could take place at all. And more than a few spent their remaining years defending the very institution and the war that had defined their lives, regardless of the cost it had exacted on millions of others. Their fates, taken together, offer no single, tidy lesson about power, loyalty, or judgment. What they do offer is a stark reminder that history rarely resolves as cleanly as the battles these men fought. If you found this account of the men behind one of history's most destructive wars compelling, subscribe to Timeless Chronicles, and let us know in the comments which story you'd like us to cover next.